Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joe Stevens. I'm the Director of MBA Programs here in the Trulaske College of Business, and thank you for being here today. Before I start, I'd like to offer a couple of reminders. Please make sure you turn your cell phones and laptops off. At this time, it can't interfere with our recording today. And please stay until the completion of the program. Our speaker today has elected to potentially engage students throughout the conversation today, as opposed to what we've typically done in the past, or often we've waited towards the end to do Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, and either Jay or Jeff will run the microphone up to you. And so, and also thanks to both of you for agreeing to help us with that. Also, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to recognize a few people that made today possible. Number one, Ewan Bond, who is the MBA Association Vice President of International Events. I'd like to offer a round of applause to Win. She's worked really hard this week to make sure it's come off well, so thank you. Robin Ridgway and Kim Hedges as well for their support to Ewan. Also, the Office of Advancement for assisting in getting this program together today. Also, Academic Support Services, who are taking care of the recording, and we'll have that streaming, or not streaming, but it will be available to you online, usually within the next couple of weeks. So for those of you that would like to take another look at it. So the International Week presentation is an important part of our college's mission in preparing students to succeed in the world of business and advancing the body of knowledge about the world of business. And today's topic is no exception. David Sides is the Senior Vice President of Worldwide Consulting for Cerner out of Kansas City, Missouri. He's held a global role for well over a decade now, ranging from managing and living in London, managing the UK and Ireland, to managing places all the way to Bangalore and around the world. He joined Cerner in 1995 and has quickly risen there. He served a stint, as I said earlier, in London, and he earned a bachelor's degree in biophysics from the University of California, Berkeley, and then later came to the University of Missouri, where he earned an MBA and an MHA, dual degree. He's been on the advisory board, the MBA advisory board here in the college since 2003, if my history is correct. And he's definitely known for getting things done. He's a huge champion for our program, and he's had a huge effect a very significant effect on the long-term success of the relationship that we've had with Cerner. Many of you know that Cerner is amongst the top, if not the top, recruiter of MBA graduates from this college. It's also important to get a context for his personality. As some of you may have seen in his bio, he comes from a family of doctors, so he obviously has a passion for his work, and he's sort of self-described black sheep. That might also go well with the fact that he's often known to ride his Harley to Columbia from Kansas City for board meetings when the weather's nice. Today I asked him about that. He said he chose the Chevy Volt, and he averaged about 65 miles to the gallon on the way over here, so that was nice. And he was even able to plug it in just outside here, where we have those we have the plugins out in the garage. So he also went to Sturgis this past year, and maybe you'll get an opportunity to ask him a question or two about that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to David. David, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Joe. What an intro. I don't have any photos of Sturgis in this presentation, but maybe we can talk about that some. I'm glad you guys aren't Marquette fans, because otherwise you wouldn't be here either. So I'm sure tomorrow will be a good day for Mizzou, the Big 12 champions. So that'll be fun. Go Tigers. So I thought I'd if you guys have questions, we did a small group before this, and you want to ask questions if something piques your interest, let's talk about it. I'll give you kind of an overview of a little bit about what Cerner does, what we're doing in some of the countries around the world, and kind of the outlook for those countries, at least from a Cerner perspective. And then maybe a little bit our thinking, how we think about entering foreign markets or markets outside the U.S. where our headquarters are. And what are some of the things you need to do or have capability for as you go into other markets. And so that'll be kind of the presentation, and we'll just ask questions as we go. And I think when we get into some of the countries, you'll probably have different questions. So this is kind of a pictorial, kind of like you'd get at Worlds of Fun of what Cerner does, what our vision is. So kind of on the left side, there's managing future demand. So this is kind of in any country, and we have different views per country that would kind of go through with government officials and things as far as what they might think about in their health system. But the ways you manage demand in the U.S. are different than they would be if you're in a nationalized health service like Canada, the UK, or Australia. So how do you get future demand managed? What do you do for integrating the healthcare system across the top? What kinds of things should we expect as consumers and taxpayers if we go to a physician's office, to a hospital, to a home health care? Should our record follow us electronically, or should we have to answer the same questions over and over about our conditions? And then on the right side, how do you drive productivity? So every country around the world has a similar problem of shortages of some type of professional, either physician, nurses, pharmacist, but there's never always the right mix of people at the right time. How do you drive productivity? And we think information technology is one of those components. Then you have kind of developing pressures off to this side of aging populations, right? Especially in Europe. In Japan, where they're going to get below 1-to-1, so one working person per retiree, right? That'll be a big pressure. I mean, how are you going to provide health care for that kind of population when there's only one person working per person who's retired? Lifestyle diseases, a lot of technology, and in the U.S. and most places, kind of growing consolidation of providers, especially as some governments push more regulation, where if you're a smaller provider, you can't afford to stay a small single provider in a rural community. You have to have access to capital or part of a bigger health system. And that's kind of more than just a U.S. trend. And then kind of on the other side, immediate pressures of how do you maintain access, right? So how does everyone have access to healthcare? And you've seen that in the U.S. Addressed through the legislation for the Patient-Provider Accountability Act, improving quality of outcomes. So, we should all have better health at the end of this. And you're going to have to care for more people and at the same time see less people in the hospital. So we're going to have ways that you can connect people to their providers electronically or digitally with electronic scales, Bluetooth scales, things like that, so that you can monitor people without having to wait for them to present at hospital and then you're reacting to a problem. So there's lots of ways that technology could play a part there. And I think that the cost pressures and the labor pressures are going to have to drive some innovative solutions there, because we can't keep going where, somebody is starting to feel short of breath, has a heart attack, goes in, we pay $20,000 to fix them. And you could have predicted that a couple days ago and maybe had a different outcome. And saved a lot of productivity for that person and for society because you're doing it at a bigger scale. So losing that productivity for all of us is bad, and it's not a good outcome. So you think about that from the middle part is, kind of a society perspective, an individual perspective, and what are the implications of that. So that's kind of, at a high level, what we think about, country by country, what our vision is of how we're trying to do things. And then specifically, we do it through technology. So we try to improve both health, how do you keep people well, and care through technology. Most of our business today is on the care side. So you're at a physician office, you're at a hospital, home health care, et cetera. And one of the things we think that you have to start with is collecting data electronically as part of the care process. So the data can't live in paper if you want to do something new and better with it. It has to be electronic. Then you use that data to think about populations and plans of care. So how can I improve the health of my population? What kinds of things do they have in that? What kind of diseases do I have? How can I prevent them and do things better? And then if you move down, you start to embed some of that knowledge or evidence into the clinical process. So if you're working with, if you're a physician working with someone in a community and you know that there's higher levels of diabetes, you can start to do things like work with their diabetes maybe before it even manifests itself. And then once you do that, you start to embed real-time clinical evidence. And as you learn things, you just keep going around this loop. So as you start to improve things and see what works, do it again and make it electronic so that it's automated in there from there forward. So that's a quick overview of Cerner. On the financial side, we had a great year in 2011. Our sales were up almost 40%. Our revenue was up about 20%. Earnings per share are up 26%. So that basically tells you that we're driving productivity into our own workforce to grow our earnings per share faster than our revenue. And we have about $1 billion in cash, and we generate a good amount of free cash flow. And so from a stock perspective, if you look at Cerner since its IPO versus Apple, Cerner's outperformed it as an example of how it's gone in the, another way to view the success of the company. So a lot of that growth has come organically through new solutions offerings, and some of that's come through entering new markets. So now I'll kind of talk about a little bit what we've done globally, taking solutions that were developed in the US and Canada to countries outside the US, and we do business now on 6 continents. Sometimes I joke we should just give the system away in Antarctica just for fun, so that way we could say we got all 7, but so far nobody's wanted to take that trip to go down there to install it. So we'll see if we can get that going here maybe and knock the last one off. So we do business in 23 countries. We started doing business outside the US in 1985 in Canada and the UK. The stock went public in 86, so we already had a kind of international view. And then if you kind of move forward, you'll see we've done business in quite a few countries. Some of the latest, the country of Qatar, we are basically going to automate that entire country will be electronic with Cerner systems. Was a deal we won just last year. So that's pretty exciting. We have 400 facilities outside the US that run our electronic medical record. And of our 10,000 associates in Cerner, about 1,700 work outside the US.
With automating the entire country, do you see any issues with privacy in relation to hacking?
So the question is really around if you are, have a whole country electronically. It might be a pretty nice place to go after if you were a hacker. I'm not sure exactly what you do with the information, So I mean, the thing I think that somewhat protects you a little bit is what do you do with health information? That's really useful. It's not as good as like financial information, like a social security number where you can go get a credit card and buy things. But so it is a risk that we take really seriously. And so we have lots of electronic protection around that type of thing. So one of the things you might do is only allow access to that record within the country, right? So if you could use the firewall to say the only people who can access the record are within Qatar, then you might maybe take away some elements that are near there that have been doing a lot of supposed cyber terrorism in the US, right? Like the Chinese, if I name names. So I think that there are ways you can set that up, but the main point is you have to make it where the benefits outweigh the risk of that. And I think for the average consumer, if you think about, I'm living in Qatar and I go to the hospital and and let's say I'm unconscious, they have my information and they can treat me and know I'm allergic to penicillin right then and save maybe an adverse event from occurring because they know that. I think most people are happy to make that trade-off. I'm allergic to penicillin. I don't care if anybody knows because I'd prefer nobody give me penicillin because it could make me sick. So, there's just different sensitivities there. And then within the system, things that are sensitive that in some places could be discriminatory, like HIV status, those are even further protected in the system to be sure that they're very difficult to get at. That's a good question because, that it is a growing form of threat. But at the same time, the ability to do things at a country level when you can aggregate that data anonymously and say, what are the trends that are occurring in my population? Where do I have real problems? Where are we spending a lot of money? And how can we reduce that cost and spend and get more value for our money? I think we'll outweigh it. So here's some thoughts on things that we have going around the world. There's a group called HIMSS, which is the Health Information Management Systems Society, and they have levels of systems. And basically, HIMSS level 6 is you're doing most everything electronically, including all medications are electronic. And so we've started getting some of the first sites outside the US to that level of automation, namely in Canada, in Saudi Arabia, and Riyadh, King Faisal Medical Center in Spain with Marina Salud, and then we're working on Australia. So in Australia, we've gotten basically the eastern seaboard of Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria are all running Cerner systems on kind of a national scale. So even though we started in the US, we probably have the most market share in Australia. And Cerner would be more of a household name there if you're working in healthcare than in the US. And then there's some strategic opportunities coming for Cerner as well. So Russia is starting a national program. If you go back a few years ago when Iraq was starting to stabilize, they had no medical records. So Saddam Hussein wouldn't allow any medical records because he was worried that people would start collecting statistics about things like number of deaths or number of deaths from different reasons, et cetera. And so there was no paper records, any records. And so they said, we don't have any paper records. Nobody knows, how to do that. We're thinking about going electronic. Russia's in a kind of a similar state where they're thinking about moving directly to an electronic medical record. There's a national program in Saudi where they're going to divide the country up into 3 regions and make everything electronic. It's a huge country, and so it has a lot of rural clinics that you might not think about at first. You think about the big cities of Riyadh, Jeddah, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, but there's actually a lot of things to cover there. France has a national program similar to the US where they're starting to try to incentivize people to move to electronic records as well because they see the advantage of moving from physician to hospital to other forms of care and being able to see that electronically and not having to re-enter things. Please.
You make a really good point about Saudi Arabia having rural clinics and things like that. How will Cerner connect with these rural clinics and things like that? You also have Brazil and Russia. How will you connect with these remote sites, especially where that infrastructure may not currently exist?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. There's a lot of different ways. I'd say in all countries around the world, there's getting to be a lot better cellular access than you might think. So one way is to kind of leapfrog laying landlines out to the middle of the desert and just cover it with microwaves or even satellite phones, depending on what they have. And you just need power. And so that's, I think, a way that you're seeing things starting to kind of evolve is there's actually good enough cellular as long as you can keep the footprint, say you had an iPad even, as long as you can keep the application kind of lean to not use a lot, it'll work fairly well. And the main part is how do you then transfer and move those people if they get more ill into the main center. And so another example I'd use is Australia, another huge country, not many people, like Canada, 20 million people, almost the size of the continental US. And they had huge bills from flying people into the main cities. So if you're in Victoria, it's a big state. And so people would fly 3 and 4 hours by helicopter into Melbourne to be treated because when you're out in the rural setting, they'd say, I have this kid, she's very sick, I'm not sure exactly what's wrong, but you can't take a chance. And so you'd call the helicopter. And you'd spend $20,000 flying someone into Melbourne and back. And then all of the related cost and time spent for the family to drive there. So if you flew by 3 hours, somebody's driving 9 hours to catch up. And so we put in solutions there where they do things with video conferencing now and being able to see the electronic record on one side and video conference on the other and try to diagnose if this really bad sunburn, is it going to be okay? And give them some fluids and these drugs or whatever. Or is this bad enough that you actually do need to move someone? And they saw cost savings from that right away. So I think those kinds of things will continue to evolve, and some of the labor pressure will help push it that way. Another example I'd use is in Malaysia, right? It's Indonesia. We're meeting with the Minister of Health. Tons of islands, right? If you look at Indonesia, very populated, but mainly on these main islands, but there's lots of little islands. And they have one nephrologist for the whole country, so someone who works on the kidney. And he's like, and in the US, we're kind of timid about some of these topics like video conferencing and remote care. And he's like, so you mean I could take care of a patient without ever having to see them one time, and I could prescribe a drug for them and be done with it? And we're like, well, yeah. He's like, perfect, that's exactly what I want. Because we don't have time to see all these people, right? It's just too big. It's too big of a country. It's, couple time zones from end to end, too many islands. He's like, they're going to die otherwise. So a totally different view of, privacy and healthcare of this person's going to die if we don't, see them electronically, because there's no way they're traveling to Jakarta. I mean, it's just too far. And that's a risky trip too. So I think some of those pressures in the US are around traffic in Seattle. So, people trying to get to the hospital in Seattle in the ambulance are trying to use remote monitoring techniques for heart attacks and other things because you could be stuck in traffic for 3 hours, have the same applicability to being in, Brazil trying to fly to Sao Paulo because it's 3 hours from the jungle into the city. So some of those things I think are just a different view, but the same application of technology, and they're pretty interesting. So what's Cerner doing in some of the global markets? Oh, please.
Sorry. I was wondering, between these various national programs that you have, is there any federation between them? Like, can data transfer, across boundaries, and how does that work?
I would say that loose federation. So there is an organization called Health Level 7 that tries to help define interoperability between systems. And it's done a decent job. But what really is driving interoperability is actually meaningful use program in the US. So the US requires that you can send a clinical document between systems in XML format if you care about some of the technical details, so it can be consumed by most systems. And that standard existing in the US almost makes it exist around the world because the US is still the biggest market for healthcare and healthcare IT. And so anyone who's doing business in the US has that capability and are starting to use it in other countries. So if you went from, if you're in Europe, most of the countries have a treaty with the other EU countries that you can be seen in those countries for healthcare, and that'll be free. It won't cost you any money. So if you're in France and you go vacation in Spain and you're sick, that's fine, not a problem. And so what they want to start doing now is sending those electronic records back. So I was on vacation in Spain, I got sick. Please send the record back to my primary care physician so when I come back, he or she can continue my care. So we're just starting to see the beginning of that, and I'd say it's probably been driven by a stronger standard of interoperability than there was there before, because before it was mainly conversation and there wasn't a practical way technically to send information between countries. But there is a use case for that because you can get sick anywhere. So for Cerner, on the top, we really have pretty good market share in Australia and Canada. And so in Australia, we've been installing in New South Wales for a long time. We have almost every public hospital in New South Wales live with Cerner, working with the private hospitals. And Queensland, we won in Q3 of last year, and we're going to automate all those hospitals. So great there. Canada, right, and Australia has never gone into recession, right? So when you read these things in The Economist or the Wall Street Journal, and you think, how can that be, right? Or if you read it and you think it's not applicable, right, I challenge you to think about what, you go to Australia, the unemployment rate is below 4%, never went above 5% during this recession. So a very resource-rich country, but also a pretty good government as far as managing their money, not going into a lot of debt. And so they were able to do things to move things along. So for us, it's been a great marketplace. Canada is somewhat similar. They did go into recession a little bit, but not anything like the US has. And we're working in 9 of the 10 provinces, and there's a lot of focus in Canada on how do they do things at a population level, because the government is going to pay for every time anyone gets sick. In Latin America, we're working on developing new footprints. Same in Southeast Asia. In Latin America, I'd say by far the biggest is Brazil, then Mexico, as far as economies that you go after. And so we should be doing business in Mexico here in the next 90 days. And we'll see about Brazil because we're translating to Portuguese and working on he's coming. And we're working on the market entry there because you still have to work with the local governments.
How do you deal with the language barrier in these countries, being an English-speaking company originally?
Yeah, a couple ways. So that's a good question. I would say the easy part is translating software to a new language, right? Because you can translate the software, and in the software, you can bring up, when we install Millennium, it looks the same in every country, and you can just flip a flag and the language changes on the screens. So that part isn't too bad. It's a one-time kind of translation cost and then some maintenance. The hard part is answering the phone in Portuguese forever. Because we have a view, once you enter a country, you can't leave. So once you have a hospital live on the system, you can't leave while they're still running your system. So you need to have people 24 hours a day who can answer the phone in native language, ideally, and help them if they had a downtime or something else. And then from an implementation perspective, how do you implement the system? Like in Chile, we have a hospital live in Santiago. We sent down 3 people from the US who are bilingual Spanish, and we hired local people, sent them through training, and installed the entire system with basically 3 people from the US. So a really low cost of entry to do that, because if we'd have tried to build up a huge workforce, it's difficult when you first enter a country because your sales pipeline isn't going to be very predictable. You'll know hopefully when your first deal signs, but sometimes your 3rd, 4th, 5th deal, you're not sure when it's going to sign, so it's hard to do how many people should I hire? But we'll do the implementation with local people as much as possible, and then some expertise from another country. And it varies. So like in the Middle East, we have an office in the UAE, but we use people from India and then sometimes from France, because France has a pretty decent-sized Arabic population, and those 2 countries, India and France, help feed and fuel that business. So where we have kind of market leadership is in the UK and Middle East, and in the UK we have a good reputation, some big go-lives. We run Oxford Hospital and Clinics, for example. So good work there. In the Middle East, we have a lot of market share. We've been doing business in the Middle East since about 1992, when we started doing business in Saudi. Now we do business in multiple countries there. And each country, if you're in the Gulf region, they're fairly similar as far as regulation, et cetera. If you go to other places like Libya, et cetera, it varies a little bit more, but it's a good market, a very good growing market, not much of a recession. And then if you have continental Europe with France, Germany, and Spain, those countries are definitely in recession. The debt problems are real, the unemployment's real, and we're kind of really just battened down, and we have workforces in those countries, and we're just working them in different places than their own home country to keep things afloat as we move forward. And they'll recover. It's just going to take a little bit longer. So I thought I might talk a little bit about how do we think about entering markets. And here's some of the markets we're thinking about. So China, Colombia, Finland, India, Italy, Lebanon, Mauritius, which, I think we'd all sign up to go on the sales visit for Mauritius. Norway, Russia, South Africa, Sweden, and Ukraine. So we think a lot of different factors when you're thinking about market entry. And our process here is first we do market evaluation. Someone will go and meet with whoever the buyer is, private industry or government, et cetera. And we'll do a little evaluation before that I'll talk about. Then we'll look at the intellectual property. What kinds of things would we need to do to the software to fit that market? Does it need to be translated to a new language like Norwegian? Is the workflow remarkably different because they practice medicine differently or not? And then we'll do a full business case thinking about how are we going to support this long term? Do we have enough business to start? How are we going to grow the skills to implement the system? But before we get to that, we kind of have, before the market evaluation, just a big spreadsheet thinking about different things that you'd need to be able to do. So how much do they spend on healthcare? Is it a regional buyer or is it an individual hospital by hospital buyer, so it'll have a high cost of entry? Is it politically stable? And we used to go through the politically stable, and people like to kind of brush through that part. But with the Arab Spring, right, you have a whole new view of that. And so one of the things we look at a lot with Russia, I think, is politically, is it a stable country? Same with China, right? Because you don't want to be doing business in China right when the next revolution comes, which is overdue, and then all of a sudden you have lots of things to work through. So those are real risk. But that's some of the way that we think about those, and then we start meeting with and moving through the process, and you can kind of see, like in Colombia, we think Colombia is actually a decent market. So a lot less violence than it used to have, probably safer than Mexico. And so you have to really keep looking at the market because, I think if you would ask someone 5 years ago which is safer, Mexico or Colombia, you'd say Mexico. Now that's totally opposite. You want to be sending people there every week. Then finally, we kind of have a view of what we sell and support in every country. And you'll see there's a lot of red, so there's many things we won't sell in all countries, and we just kind of keep thinking about that list of if a country's not very automated, you don't need to have, maybe the iPad to walk around if they're not automated, or lots of medical devices. If they're highly automated, then you can think about those things as far as their market maturity. So a lot of different, country-specific factors that work in there. I'd say mainly regulatory, not usually cultural, because everyone's, kind of wants the same kind of healthcare. You want to have the highest level of health you possibly can as an individual, no matter where you live. It just may be your government pays for that high level of healthcare in different ways. And how they pay for it may drive what things they find acceptable or not as far as ways to deliver that. So with that, I'd be happy to take your questions. Please.
You mentioned the iPad and not being able to carry it in less developed countries. I was just wondering if you could speak on how mobile applications have influenced or improved Cerner's developments.
I think mobile applications are a good improvement, especially around productivity, right? So I don't know what you guys use to organize your day. I use like Outlook Calendar and kind of organize most of my, both personal and professional life around that. Until, 10 years ago, if you would talk to an average physician how they organize their day, right, they have no idea what's on their schedule for that day, right? They would, I go to the hospital in the morning, I see whatever patients are there, they try to get a list to go find them all, and then you go to the hospital, then you go to the clinic at the same time and you look at who's there. So not very efficient compared to, how most people kind of organize things of knowing, all right, I got to get these things done today, so I need to be in this kind of time frame. So I think mobility is super helpful and also really good for, just productivity of just when you're walking between exam rooms, you can still be finishing up the previous person's note, right? Compared to if you just have a desktop, you have to sit there and finish typing everything. Just that extra 3 minutes to look at the next person's record could be enough where you walk in and you look like you're well informed when you walk in the room compared to the current structure, which is you walk in, you grab a piece of paper, you're not looking at the person, you're reading the paper. Okay, you're here to see, okay, you've got this, okay. Right? You're walking down the hall with your iPad, okay, they have this. All right. Oh, hi, doctor. Or, yeah, Mrs. Smith, how are you? It's good to see you again. Things like that, I think, help also improve the patient experience because they do keep notes in there. Things like, you're having a baby, you have a new dog, whatever. Those kinds of things are in the system and can give you a more personal experience.
So can you explain the process behind entering a new market? How do you initiate conversations? How do you decide which markets to go for? Thanks.
Yeah, so kind of like I was talking about a couple slides ago, we basically have a ranking of all countries in the world. And we rank them based on healthcare spend, how sophisticated they are with IT, how stable they are, and do they have any, large purchasing events like national programs, regional, state, province-wide programs, et cetera. And then, you kind of get an idea, you can kind of quantify what your growth pattern might look like in those. So we know from entering markets, you usually get one client, then you get 2 or 3. Once you're in 3 in some marketplaces, you have to be in 3 clients live in order to answer RFPs. So once you hit 3, then all of a sudden you can answer any RFP and you can really take off. And that process probably takes 2 or 3 years to have that. And so we'll look ahead and we'll say, okay, we're looking for this kind of growth out of our global marketplace. Here's the growth we're going to get steady state from our existing markets. This gap, how many countries are we going to have to enter or do business in to make up the higher growth rate that we'd like to see? And then once we have that smaller list of here are the countries that look attractive, we'll send teams in to meet with, if there's like in Australia, the biggest for-profit healthcare system is called Ramsay Health. We'll have someone go meet with Ramsay Health and see if they're looking for a system. We'll go talk to the Minister of Health of New South Wales and try to get an idea of those kinds of things. And then once you have that kind of smaller list, you can then say, okay, here's our smaller list. What do we really have to deliver? What kind of people will it take, et cetera? And you can start making real plans.
Please correct me if I misstate any preamble facts. It seems like if you're really sick, there's no place in the world that you'd rather be than in the United States with something that's really very serious and complex. And yet it seems that most reports have that we spend about 17% of our GDP on healthcare, and many countries that spend 10% or less have better outcomes for the general population. So in that light, after seeing all these different systems, have you developed a perspective on what would be the best healthcare system to serve an industrialized nation?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of nuance in that statement of if you're really sick, the U.S. can be the best place to be. Because there's actually, I think there's a lot of parentheses behind that. If you're really sick and you have access to good private health care insurance, so you're not on Medicaid or Medicare, right, where there'll be some limits. And you're really sick on something very specialized, like a really rare form of cancer, where you can be at the academic medical center where it's developed or whatever. Because I would say in the vast, kind of majority of your, mainly well, that's where the U.S. kind of falls down. It's in the mainly well or you're kind of sick. You know what I mean? If you're kind of sick, I think you can get better care in other countries. They actually do a really good job of, moving those people along pretty quickly because they're efficient, and they've been working on driving down those costs, because the main cost is either in the last 60 days of life. And so to your question about where's the best healthcare system, I think all of the world, and in some countries it's more advanced, right? So in India, I'd say there's very good acceptance of end of life, thought process. I'd say the U.S. is not very, is at a place that's very expensive, right? So the U.S. doesn't have a lot of living wills, and people don't really want, to die. Nobody wants to die, but I think people in the U.S. are willing to suffer horrific treatments by the medical establishment to try to stay alive 5 more days at an enormous cost. And I think that's starting to change in all developed countries, because they're saying, look, we're spending 70% of our money on 5% of the people in the last 30 days of life, and it's not worth the productivity gain for those last 30 days of life. And so I think you'll see that kind of go through lots of systems. And I think the U.S. is starting to adapt with commonly called Obamacare, to the thought of starting to measure outcomes and pay for performance. And those are really well developed in other countries. So if you're diabetic in the UK, you see your primary care physician, you get a foot exam, eye exam, and your sugar levels are monitored well, they get paid more. Because if those don't happen and somebody goes blind or loses a foot, which are very possible outcomes of diabetes not managed, they know that that's bad. Well, in the U.S., there is no incentive for that kind of thing, other than it's good care, but it's kind of different when they've kind of systematized it and measure it and report on it constantly, and then incentivize people to do good care as well. I think there's things to learn from those systems.
Kind of following up on U.S. healthcare, considering the regulatory issues with HIPAA and things like that, how does Cerner deal with the regulatory and privacy issues that currently kind of hound the U.S. healthcare system?
Yeah, I think I think most of those things like HIPAA, which is the Health Information Portability and I think Accountability Act, is really probably mainly good, right? So it's basically it's one of its main intents was to make electronic records portable, or to make your record portable. And the other was to protect your privacy of your record when it's electronic, and has stiff fines for people who violate that. And so, some of those things exist today. It's just harder to track. So if you're in a paper-based hospital today, it's pretty easy to pick up anyone's chart and just read it. Now, the good news is you can't read it and publish it on the internet with WikiLeaks or something like that. So that's kind of helpful. But at the same time, you can now see things that are who's accessing your record electronically that you couldn't see before. So I think Cerner tends to think the best way to guard privacy is to give information to the individual person, the consumer. So for example, if I have a personal health record and I can see everyone who looked at my electronic record, right, I will know faster than anyone in an IT department who my next door neighbor is. And then my next door neighbor didn't ever see me, but they work at the hospital and they're a nurse and they looked at my record, right? And then you have stiff penalties for that. You fire them for that kind of thing. And you do that a couple times, just like any kind of misconduct, I think it starts to self-regulate itself.
So I think a hot topic that I heard, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that nursing is in demand in some of those types of healthcare position, and a lot of the technology that Cerner does seems like it can really help with those problems. And how far, realistically, do you see this kind of going, this automation in hospitals, and kind of where do you think it can get, maybe within 10, 15 years?
I think it can be pretty automated. So as an example, we had a baby not too long ago. You're in the room, and maybe your pain's getting worse or whatever. You hit this call button, and it goes beep, and then you're like, sometimes they don't even answer. They just come in the room. Can I help you? And it's like, yeah, I got some pain or whatever. And they, okay, let me go get a Tylenol. They walk down the hall. They come back with Tylenol, give you the Tylenol, right? And there's studies that show nurses walk almost 5 miles a day on the average shift. And there's no reason for that, right? So we have an application. They just have a voice over IP phone with a little scanner on it. You call and you just answer the phone. Yeah, can I help you? Yeah, I've got some pain. Okay, let me get the Tylenol and bring it in. You just do it in one trip, right? Compared to walking in, seeing what's wrong, walking out, getting the Tylenol, going back. I mean, that kind of stuff, if you spend any time in hospitals, you'll see it's just rampant. Opportunities for people with lean knowledge and process engineering type thoughts, right, to look at it differently. And I was telling a story earlier that we do work with employers too, and we're meeting with some employers, some manufacturing people in the U.S., right, which is something that, we lost our lead in, right? We're no longer the largest manufacturer in the world. And they were talking about, look, we're no longer the leading manufacturer in the world because some of these things in other industries are hurting us, and healthcare is one of them. And they're like, the way we were competing with the Chinese and the Germans is we're getting better every day. We've been doing Lean Six Sigma for 20 years. We didn't do it because we wanted to. We did it because we have to drive down our cost and waste out of our system completely to be able to compete with people that have lower labor cost. It's the only way to do it is productivity. And then on this other side, we have this thing called healthcare, growing faster than inflation, eating up our profits, and there's no Lean Six Sigma thoughts in these organizations. And they're the thing that's actually making us less competitive. And so when they say that they don't have room to move, we say, we'll send in our process engineer and show you where you have room to move because you need to flatten out that curve for us to remain competitive. And I think there's a macro topic for us all in that conversation, actually, of if the U.S. is to be a productive, competitive country long term, we have got to be productive in all industries, right? You can't have one like healthcare growing at 6% a year for long term and not have that affect our overall productivity because we're all giving that up as wage, right? We're paying it out as benefit instead of wage, and that's not where we'd like to usually spend our money.
Sort of in light of this information and informatics sort of talk and privacy issues, could you speak a little bit to, are there any things that Cerner is doing with services to look at medical informatics, health informatics, and predictive modeling and things like that? Or is that something that other companies are doing too, or what are you doing in that area?
Yeah, so we work a lot in informatics and thinking about things like natural language processing. So how do you take the things that are in the record that aren't codified and codify them? And then also a lot of the predictive modeling to try to recommend treatments for people. So one example of that, we talked a little earlier too about, so Millennium is an enterprise medical record, and we started to connect it into some cloud-based services. A perfect example is sepsis. So sepsis is a major killer of people. I mean, it kills tons of people. It's blood infection. And, like 90,000 people a year. I mean, it's totally unacceptable that it kills that many people in the U.S. a year. I mean, it's eminently preventable and identifiable. The algorithm is very straightforward. If your blood pressure goes down, your temperature goes up, and you start to be disoriented, et cetera, you might have sepsis. So what we've done is we started hooking up records, and we run looking for people who might have sepsis all the time in kind of the cloud, because what can happen is you go from your one hospital to another hospital, and you're transferring hospitals, especially if you're started in a rural environment, and people just lose track of the trend line is really bad. And so we've just started offering those kinds of services. We offer them free, the sepsis one, because the president of Canada's wife died of sepsis, and our CEO's sister-in-law died of sepsis. And we were just like, this is crazy. This shouldn't be happening. And so we're working with our clients just to run that to try to make a difference there. to see if there's a better outcome. And there's many more examples like that.
Just a quick question on the profitability aspect of it. In a day when there's a lot of mandated legislation and people are perhaps doing things because they have to, not because they want to, what kind of return on investment does a private or a public organization get because of this increased technology advances in their industry or their organization?
Yeah, so, well, there's two sides to that. So one, on the regulation side, there's not a good return on regulation. It's costing them money. So the regulations are becoming, I would say, sophisticated enough that there are many parts of healthcare that you must be automated. You can't report manually from it. And for example, long-term care facilities are trending that way. So today, most long-term care facilities are totally in paper. But it doesn't take many things in a country, many negative press stories of people dying because of mistakes, et cetera, where people get outraged and they're like, look, we're not having that anymore. This is ridiculous. And so you make regulations to protect people and start gathering data, and at some point you can no longer just abstract from a paper record for that. So that side, I think, is the side that costs money but should have better outcomes if the regulations are prudent. And then on the other side is, why all of us have computers, because they can make you much more efficient and productive in how you run your life. And mobility is a good piece of that too, because now you can do things anywhere. So if you're a physician, you can work from home now and do your charts from home and not have to be in the office. Well, that freeing people from being where the paper is can drive productivity for them. And I think you'll see people over time have even more virtual models of medicine, right? So today, radiologists can read radiology films anywhere, right? You don't have to be at the hospital to look at a radiology image and say, this person has a broken bone or they have this, right? So that industry is already kind of going through a disruption. I think over time, it'll disrupt even more specialties. And, if you think about it even more broadly, you could start to say, okay, does the radiologist have to be based in the U.S.? What if they're based in Mexico? What if they're based in India doing reads at nighttime? So when we use actually India at Cerner, it's mainly for time zone change because nobody likes to work nights, right? But if you're working in the daytime, because India's a perfect 12-hour shift from the U.S., people are happy to work during the day. And so we have people doing database administration, things like that at night. Well, okay, let's shift that same model to the U.S. You're in Wichita. You can't get any radiologists to work night because you're a 50-year-old radiologist. Why would you want to work nights? Right? You've been working hard your whole life. You don't want to work nights. I'll work during the day, fine. But then at night, why don't you send those films off somewhere else and have people read them? And I think that's happening, and I think it'll just accelerate.
Okay. Earlier, you referenced the drag on the economy in the U.S. for our expenses in healthcare. And of course, from your comments, we're not going to quote you, but you might be on a death panel to have us have a different end-of-life point of view. But I'll leave that aside. Aside from the efficiencies that come from technology and delivering healthcare and high-quality healthcare, I believe one of the major problems is we have a systemic inertia, that there's a system that's existing between insurance companies and healthcare systems and providers and the way we've always done things. Beyond the technology, do you think that the move to electronic systems will change the basic systems that would engender larger savings and just efficiency improvements?
I think so. And so maybe an example would be, if you look at U.S. healthcare, a third of it's spent on insurance company functions, right? That's a lot compared to how we usually purchase things. So like I buy a car, I buy car insurance, right? I don't pay a car insurance thing to buy my tires, to insure against every risk. I buy tires. And that kind of pricing makes it where people are looking for the best price, and it drives down prices. I think that same thing, health insurance in the U.S. needs to become insurance again and not a way to purchase health care, right? So an easy way that people proposed was no longer deductibility for health insurance, right? You can't deduct it off your taxes anymore. Right there to be immediately, right? A lot of us, we'd be a lot more, or let's say you, instead of paying the premiums you pay for health insurance and the one that your employer is paying you, and I think this will probably be an outcome of some of Obamacare, some employers will get out of health insurance as a benefit entirely. And they'll just say, you know what? I'm going to give you the $5,000 I was spending, your salary. do with it what you will. I think you'd see healthcare prices start to go down pretty dramatically as people started shopping around saying, okay, I'm going to buy insurance because I can't afford anything over $5,000. You know, any risk over $5,000, I'm not going to pay for. But the other, you gave me $5,000, you know, that $5,000, I might be able to be pretty efficient with that. And if the savings accrue to me, right, and I only spend $1,000 this year instead of $5,000, right, the whole thing just benefited.
But what about those people with serious pre-existing conditions? They couldn't buy insurance for $5,000.
Yeah, and that's why I think that things like, you know, Obamacare saying you can't not insure people for pre-existing conditions, I think that makes sense. And I think most societies think, you know, similar lines, right? There should be, you know, there's some conditions you can't control. But at the same time, if you smoke and I don't, do I want to pay more? Those debates go on. And I think you've seen in Europe a huge shift in that. While I was living there from like 2003 to 2008, almost every country banned smoking while I was there. And if you think that didn't have anything to do with the fact that they're paying for all the health care for those people, I'd disagree. So, you know, I think some of those things will start to just come together. And really, that's really a societal change, right? People are saying, hey, you know, you can choose to smoke if you want, but you can't smoke inside anymore, and you can't do this. And, you know, that's really society changing. I mean, that's true politics of, you know, people saying, I'm not, you know, we're not going to pay for this kind of thing anymore. And on your death panel thought, rationing's happening today in the U.S. Too. It happens in every country. Yeah. I mean, everyone has rationing. And we were talking about earlier, too, the U.S. is already, the government pays about 50% of health care. So, you know, the U.K. is 85%, the U.S. is 55%. When the government pays the majority, is that socialized medicine already? You're just arguing about how much private has a role in it. But the majority, you know, Medicare and Medicaid are massively big spending programs.
So it seems that Cerner's general mission is to build efficiency in the exchange of healthcare information. So as a consultant, how valuable would a medical search engine be for Cerner's growth? And has your company considered this route?
So our real mission is to improve the health and care of communities. And we have built into the software search capabilities. So you can search both within the medical record, you can search outside, things like Google or Medline, and we're starting to search other people's electronic medical records too. The problem with search is really, you know, how do you distill it? Because there can be a lot of superfluous information. And how do you broaden it at the same time? So we do things like, to filter it, you know, there's a lot of filters you can apply on the side, like take out all nursing notes or only show me procedures or diagnosis. And on the broaden it side, we look for synonyms or like things or like classes of drug. So if Tylenol is acetaminophen, that's this class of drug, non-steroid, you know, whatever. And we then look for other drugs like it. Because if you're searching for it, you're probably looking for any instance of it, right? The strict word search doesn't work in healthcare. There's too many synonyms for things.
I was just wondering, how does Cerner protect its brand from misuse of its products? I mean, for example, if you go to an emerging market and there's a major breach of health information, or there's a major failure of care linked with the Cerner system, you know, does that factor into your decision at all?
Oh, a ton. I mean, that's a great question. We argue about that as an executive team all the time, actually. Some of those topics of how do you, and one of the topics is we have clients operating our systems, let's say, well, yeah, University of Missouri here, right? What if they start doing things wrong with the system and they set up unsafe care with the system and, you know, the system's just automating unsafe care or, you know what I mean? Because you could do, now you're doing it faster because the computer's doing it. So we talk about that a lot, and we try to put controls in. So how we do that is, you know, contractually you try to have controls of you have to have this level, and even just with doctors, right? If doctors are using the system and they think it doesn't work well because the people running the computer, it's going down all the time, you know? So if you had Gmail and it was down every other hour, right, you'd hate Gmail and you'd switch. The same thing can happen to us, and because we're not in control of running their system, they're bringing it down all the time. People don't like it. So we try to do things like audit people systems. So we audit, client systems around the world, and then try to, have conversations with them around, this isn't actually very good. This isn't the standard of care. Could you improve this way? But it's a really difficult balance to advise someone on a better way to do things and not be kind of overbearing where they won't do it, but protect your brand, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to be affected if it's a poor outcome. So that's one that doesn't have a good answer, right? It just has, you just work on it, because it's tough.
On your first slide, one of the things that you noted was lifestyle choices and lifestyle diseases. Could you speak to how Cerner is trying to mitigate those and make people make the right decisions so that those don't exist?
Yeah, and I'd say, so one of the ways that we've done that is we use ourselves as guinea pigs. And so we started about 8 or 9 years ago running our own health plan. So we fired our insurance company. So any employers over, somewhere between 100 and 500, certainly anyone over 500, is self-insured. You pay first dollar as an employer. Now, that's something I think people don't realize a lot in the U.S., but the employers are really paying first dollar if you're of any size of every healthcare benefit. And then we have reinsurance, with our insurance company of Lloyd's of London or whatever. So we have reinsurance at Cerner over $2 million, because premature babies can run over $2 million in no time. And so the things we started doing, we started with basic things. Here's your electronic health record. If you fill out a health risk assessment, we'll give you $100. We call them points, but every one of them is $1, so I don't know why I don't call them dollars. But so here's $100. If you get your biometrics taken, which is your height, weight, and a blood test, we'll give you another $150. If that says that you're diabetic and you manage your blood sugar, you'll get $400. If you're a smoker and you quit smoking, we'll give you $400, and we'll pay for all the smoking cessation classes you could ever want. That kind of thing. And so those get pretty sophisticated over time. And so we've modeled that out. And now you start to do things that are, one of our biggest costs is pregnancy, because we have a younger, maybe possibly workforce, and pregnancy can be expensive. And so we've started to look at how can we put together, with local hospitals and physicians, the highest possible outcome pregnancy, experience, cover everything that you possibly want, have people have a private room, stay extra days in the hospital, et cetera, to try to really improve the experience of our associates and drive down our costs at the same time. And then we offer those services to other companies. So we now sell that as a service to other companies as a way to manage the health of their population. Because, right, if you could do that well enough, when the company's already paying the first dollar, you start to say, why do I need this insurance company in the middle? Right, I'll just direct contract, or I'll use the electronic network to do it directly, which is what we're starting to do in Kansas City. So we pay people the same day. So if someone goes to the physician office and they say, yep, I did this, and they do these health checks, we pay them right then. So you can get people to be pretty excited about that compared to going through the 90-day insurance process. Because we know we're going to pay it, so why wait? You know what I mean? There's a better way, right, with less administrative cost and higher outcomes that we should be able to do things.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, guys.
So some amazing insights there. Thank you so much. And a key takeaway, I think, for the students is if you want to be this good at your job, it doesn't hurt, one, to have passion, and you wear it on your sleeve so well. And you need to know it inside and out. So thank you again. Before we leave, I'd like to present. We have a couple things for you. First, a plaque. So Vaughn, Executive in Residence Lecturer. To David Sides, thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it. Again. And in the spirit of March Madness, sometimes we do boring gifts, but this one today I think is particularly nice. We have to send you home with a Frank Haith ball. So
wow, great. Thank you. That's good. Thank you, guys. I'll come speak again.
And I was a little nervous you would have to take that home on your Harley, but since you brought the Volt, we're okay.
Yeah.
So, thanks to everyone for being here tonight. This afternoon. Great job with the questions, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.